University, is the senior poisik of the YU and world-renowned poisik. Yeah, we are very honored to welcome Schachter again. It's been a while, and we're looking forward to hear the Rav's Divrei Torah.
Shalom Aleichem, everybody. We have in Halacha two types of melchamas. There's a melchamas reshus and a melchamas mitzvah. What's an example of a melchamas reshus? If the government in Eretz Yisrael wants to expand their borders and want to take over Syria and Lebanon, if they're doing it for security purposes, that could well be that's a melchamas mitzvah. But if they just want to expand the border, that's considered melchamas reshus. So in order to, whenever you go to Muhammad, there are two major problems. Number one,
Rav, I think you're muted. You're mute. You're mute. Yeah.
How about now?
Yeah. Perfect.
so I should start back from the beginning?
The two points.
So the Alpidin had two types of melchamas. There's melchamas reshus and melchamas mitzvah. Melchamas reshus is just to expand the borders of Eretz Yisrael. So in the days of David HaMelech, he expanded the borders. So in order to engage in a melchamas reshus and any melchama, there are two issues. One issue, you're putting your soldiers into sakana. You're not allowed to put Jewish lives into sakana. And number two, you're killing enemy. You're killing Nachrim is also an Issa. So in order to wage melchamas reshus, the Mishnah says that we require authorization from the Bezdin HaGadol and authorization from the Urim V'Tumim. His man is that we don't have a Bezdin HaGadol and we don't have any Urim V'Tumim, so you can't have any melchamas reshus. I don't think anybody is interested in getting involved in melchamas reshus anyway. But then you have melchamas mitzvah. So what are examples of melchamas mitzvah? One example is Hatu Yisrael Miyad Sar. If the Jews are being attacked by enemies, so that's melchamas mitzvah. That's one example of melchamas mitzvah. Whom did they draft into the army? So the pasuk says in the beginning of Parshas Bamidbar, we should take the census of Bnei Yisrael. The Beresim Shalom V'Mala Kol Yotzei Tzava B'Yisrael. We should take a census of the men over 20 because we only draft into the army those who are men who are over 20. The Gemara says the first daf in Kiddushin, you don't draft women into the army. That's a beferish bar in Kiddush. Then the pasuk says you only draft people over 20 years old. What's up is 20? Usually bar mitzvah is either Yud Gimel Shana V'Emechad, or by girls it's Yud Beis Shana V'Emechad. So the Gemara says in many places, in Midrashim like that the Bezdin Shalmaila only punishes people who do Averis if they do the Averis after the age of 20. There's a godless, the personality begins to be crystallized, begins to be formed approximately the age of 12 or 13. And it's completed, the personality years ago used to be completed approximately the age of 20. I think the psychologists say that today it's a year or two later. Okay, so that's an issue. But so in order to hold a rifle, it's not enough that he's a little bit of a bardas. He has to be more of a bardas, that he should hold the rifle to make sure that he doesn't harm innocent civilians. So you only draft into the army one who has a full din of God, like the Bezdin Shalmaila, only punishes. Bezdin Shalmaila is more lenient. Bezdin Shalmaila only punishes those who do Averis after the age of 20. The Gemara has, let's say, the father died and the children yashid all the assets of the father. So the Gemara says, let's say the father left automobiles and svarim and other things, so they can sell it. If they don't want it, they can sell it. But linka minich sayav, if to sell real estate, you can make major mistakes. And in order to sell real estate that he yashid from the father, it has to be it has to be over at the age of 20. Unless the kid, let's say, said a little kid, just barely bar mitzvah, he sold Kool-Aid and he sold Arabis on Sukkot and he made a fortune and he bought his own real estate. Then he can sell. If he bought it based on what he earned himself, he's intelligent enough, then he can sell it also. But to sell a karka that he got Pirusha from the father, you have to be the higher level of godless. So you don't draft into the army men younger than 20. You don't draft women into the army. That's the Gemara. Yeah. What about Levium? Are Levium drafted into the army? So the pasuk says in the end of Chumash Bamidbar, there was Malchemes Midyan, and they took Elef Lamata. They took 1,000 soldiers from each Shevet. They had 12,000 soldiers in the army, and they waged Milchama against Midyan. So that's a question, why only 12,000? It should be 13,000. There were 12 Shvatim, but Shevet Yosef is divided into Menashe and Ephraim. So the two Pshatim over here. So some Rashi and Chumash, it's the two opinions in the Sifrei. So Rashi and Chumash quotes the opinion from the Tanaim that Shevet Levi was drafted into the army. That's Elef Lamata, 1,000 soldiers from Shevet Levi. And Menashe and Ephraim count as one Shevet. For some purposes, we count them as two Shvatim, but for the purposes of the draft in the army over here, on Malchemes Midyan, it only counts as Menashe and Ephraim is counted as one Shevet. Together, they gave 1,000 soldiers. The Rambam sounds like he says in the end of Hilchos Shemitah V'Yovel. So the Rambam sounds like he says that Shevet Levi is supposed to be dedicating their lives to learning Torah. And the din is like that in the Rambam and Hilchos Sanhedrin. He quotes from the Tanoim that if you have a spot in the Bez Nagorul or any Bezdin, Sanhedrin of 23, and you have two candidates for this spot, the one is a Levi, one is not a Levi, it's preferable to appoint a Levi because Shevet Levi is supposed to be dedicating their lives to Limud HaTorah. So the Rambam sounds like he says that Shevet Levi, the whole Shevet Levi is not drafted into the army. That's what it sounds like. This is very difficult because we know even Kohanim are drafted into the army. So what do you mean Shevet Levi is not drafted? At the time of the First World War, the British government was drafting many Jews into the army, and the Kohanim sent a letter to the government that they're not allowed to serve in the army because Kohanim are not allowed to be Matamil Mesim. And when you're fighting a war, there are going to be dead bodies all over the place, so they can't serve in the army. So the British government gave the Shiloh over to the one who was then the chief rabbi, I think Rabbi Nathan Adler. I think that not to be confused with Rabbi Nathan Adler, the Rebbe of the Sam Sefer, that was from the 1700s. This is from the late 1800s. I think he and Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch both got smicha from Rabbi Yankov Ettlinger. He was the Yekish Rabbanim. So he gave the Shiloh over, I think, to the Bezdin in London. London Bezdin was always prominent Talmidei Chachamim. And they came up with a Mordechai in Gittin. The Mordechai in Gittin has a Beferish Gemara that you do draft Kohanim into the Jewish army. The Gemara has a Shiloh. There's a Pasuk in Chumash. Kisetz ala Muhammad Avecha. You see a Eshes Pastor. V'chashakta bo v'lakachta l'cha l'isha. The Gemara, Rashi and Chumash quotes from the Gemara, "L'diba Torah keneged Yetzirah." The man has been away from his wife for so long, and he wants to be with a woman. So there's a din; he's allowed to be with the pastor. The Gemara says for any Jew, it's already a kula because they're not allowed to intermarry with a nochris, and this is being nisui taruvis. Even if you do a gerus, it's going to be a gerus bal karcha. So strictly speaking, it's a problem for any Jew, but that's a heter. L'diba Torah keneged Yetzirah. So they gave a heter, but the shaila is if the soldier in the army is a kohen, it's a double issa. Not only is there an issa of intermarriage with a nachris, even if the nachris would convert, the kohen is also bizaina, and every gioris is also a kohen. Even if it would have been a gerus midaita, would have been a problem. So the Gemara has the shaila. Since it's a double issa involved, maybe the heter for Yifastar is only if there's one issa. If it's a kohen, there are two issa. Not. So Gemara gives you the discussion. Rabbi Shmuel is all machlekes what the din is in that case. Well, you see, Beferish that they draft Kohanim into the army. You have to be careful not to be metame. in Vilna, there were two prominent brothers who were both Dayanim in Vilna at the same time. The older brother was Rabbi Tzalel Vilna, and the younger brother was Rabbi Shlomo Vilna. Shlomo Vilna published a few svarim. So one of the svarim, he has a table of contents in the beginning of the sefer. So he tells you b'kitza what every essay is all about in 2 or 3 lines. So he writes in the table of contents that in this certain chapter, he explained that Kohanim are not drafted into the army because of Allah and the obligation to learn Parsha Zachar every year, Shabbos before Purim. So it says in the Sefer HaChinuch, the obligation is only on men. The women are not mechuyev to hear Parsha Zachar because the women are not drafted into the army. And the reason why you have to hear Parsha Zachar, you have to know in case it'll come up on Mechemes Amalek that men have to serve in the army. Women don't have to hear Parsha Zachar because you don't draft women into the army. So Shlomo Vilna came up with the chiddush that just like you don't draft women, so Kohanim are not drafted either. So the Kohen can't be the Balkari to learn Parsha Zachar because Mishayim B'chui B'dover and Emotzi Asarabim V'dei Chayvosam. Let's say the father's out of town for Shabbos on business, and the mother feels uncomfortable saying Kiddush and Abdullah. European women feel uncomfortable because, like an almana has to make her own Kiddush and Abdullah. A normal woman is married, relies on the husband to say Kiddush and Abdullah. So the mother wants that her child, her boy, should say Kiddush. But he's not bar mitzvah yet, so he can't be Motzi the mother. Child is only Mechuyev Midirabban, and mother is Mechuyev in Kiddush and Abdullah min HaTorah. So Mishenim B'chud B'daber and Motzi Asar B'dei. So the same thing over here. Shlomo Vilna says if the Balkari is a Kohen, he can lane Parshas HaShavua, but he can't be Motzi the Tzibur with Parshas Zachar because the Kohanim are not Mechuyev in Parshas Zachar because they're not drafted into the army. So he writes it all b'kitza nimratz in a half a sentence. Then he says, my brother told me to leave it out because it's all wrong. So he left out that whole essay in his say. What's all wrong? It doesn't say what's wrong. Pashta says the whole thing is wrong because the Rishonim say beferish based on the Gemara and Kiddush, and Rama quotes it all that the Kohanim are drafted into the army. Not only they draft Levim, they draft Kohanim also. Exactly what did the Rama mean in the end of Hilchas Shemitah B'Yovel that he says the Levim are not don't serve in the army? It's a little unclear, but the Levim and the Kohanim, they're all drafted into the army. What about yeshiva students? So yeshiva students drafted into the army. So the Gemara in the Dorm says that when Avram Avinu waged war, there were the 5 kings who were fighting against the 4 kings, and the 4 kings won the war against the 5 kings. And one of the people who was captured in the war was Lot, a nephew of Avram Avinu. So Avram Avinu put together an army. So Gemara says, who was the army? So Gemara says, Eliezer, Eved Avram. Eliezer was a Talmid Chacham. He was the Eved, but Avram Avinu taught him a lot of Torah. So the Gemara says in the dorm that was not right. You're not supposed to draft Talmid Chachamim into the army. So the shaila is, every yeshiva bacha is a Talmid Chacham. Maybe the Rabbeim are Talmid Chachamim. You have to give them exams. Not everybody gets 100. Not everybody gets 65 on a bechina. Some students don't pass. Not everybody knows how to learn. And furthermore, Talmid Chachamim are not drafted in the army like the din is by Mechemes Harishus. You appoint a Kohen Mashuch Machama to read the Mihu Isha She'eres Isha V'lo L'kocha, Mihu Isha She'bana Bais V'lo Chanacha, Mihu Isha She'nat Teken V'lo Achila Lo, Yelech V'yasha V'lo Beisa. He reads the P'turim Me'orcha Machama, and then they go home. So the Gemara said that's only by Mechemes Harishus. By Mechemes Mitzvah, there are no exemptions. So the Chazon Ish writes that whenever you wage a war, you don't have every single person over the age of 20. There's an upper limit also. You don't take people younger than 20. The Sifrei talks about what's the Amr. When you reach a certain age, you're not going to function well. Most people after a certain age will not be able to be successful in battle. So there's a limited age. So the Chazon Ish writes, if you want to look it up, it's Chazon Ish and Chelek Arachaim at the end of the first parak in Eruvin, of all places. The last parak in Soita is a parak Mashuach Muhammad, has a lot of dinim al Muhammad. But some of the dinim al Muhammad appear in Erev in the end of the first parak of all places, because the Mishnah has Abod Dvar Patra B'Machna. The Tanoi made certain kulas in the Machna HaMelchama. So he discusses a little bit over this. So he says you don't draft everybody into the army. So you don't draft by Melchemes Shus, you don't draft the Chosen and so on. But let's say you have a Melchemes mitzvah and you need all the soldiers, like now in the war that they just had the last year. They were fighting on 5 different fronts at the same time. They were fighting on the border with Lebanon, fighting on the border with Syria, fighting in Yehuda v'Shamron, fighting with where was that from? With Iraq, and fighting with the South, and fighting with Yemen. They needed soldiers all over. They were missing thousands of soldiers. So the pashtus is, if you need more soldiers, and it's a Melchemes mitzvah to protect the Jews in Eretz Yisrael, so you don't exempt yeshiva bachim. You don't exempt yeshiva bachim. The pashtus is like that. Yeshiva bachim apater. If you don't draft everybody into the army, anyway. Every country wants to preserve its culture. So in America, the culture is entertainment, sports. So comedians are not drafted into the army. Entertainers are not drafted. That's the American culture. The Jewish culture is we are Am HaSefer. The Goyim called us the Am HaSefer, the nation of the book. So to have university students or Talmidim who learn in yeshivas, the Jewish people are always studying. So we want to preserve the culture of the Jewish people is to be studious, to be Talmidim, always to meet Talmidim. So the Pashta says that in this kind of a war, you can't say all the Bnei Yeshiva are exempt from the army. You have to have, the Gemara says, in the schus of the Talmidim or learning Torah, the Jewish people will be Matzliach and Melchama. The Netziv has a commentary on the Shiltas that he wrote as a teenager. So he published it in installments. First he published Bereish Shmos, then he published Vayikra, then he published Bamidbar Dvarim in 3 volumes. So when he first originally printed it, so he wrote Kid Masa Emek. Kid Masa Emek was an introduction to his Haimek Shalom. But it's not really an introduction to his commentary on it's an introduction to all of Torah Shebal Peh. Just like the Pri Megadim wrote the Psich HaKoleles, the Orach Chaim, it's not really an introduction to Orach Chaim, it's an introduction to all of Torah Shebal Peh, so to the Kid Masa Emek. So now, they don't print the introduction, the Kid Masa Emek of the Netziv was written in installments, so it was printed in installments. Now they print all 3 parts of the introduction together. And now they print it as a separate sefer, the introduction of the Netziv to all of Torah Shebal Peh. So he quotes many Gemaras to this effect. One of the more famous Gemaras, the Gemara Makkas. So the Gemara interprets Ragleinu, Ragleinu Bel Muhammad, the Jewish soldiers are successful in the battle, and the schus of Shara Yerushalayim, where they're sitting and learning. And the schus of Talmud Torah, the Jewish soldiers will be successful in battle. Because the Gemara says in other places that all the anti-Semites say like this. The Jews are responsible for all the wars in the world. So that's what the Gemara says. A surprising Gemara. The Gemara says, because we're doing Averis, that's why Rabbi Hershel makes a Melchama. We're supposed to be engaged in Melchama Shel Torah. So if we will be doing Melchama Shel Torah the way we're supposed to, then we will be Nitzel from Melchama. If we're not doing Melchama Shel Torah properly, HaKadosh Baruch Hu will make a war in Korea, make a war somewhere in Afghanistan. And we're supposed to get the hint that he means us. We should be Osik and Torah. If we don't get the hint, so he'll cause the Muhammad to come closer. Still don't get the hint, and it'll cause that the Muhammad should be in Eretz Yisrael, the Jewish people will be involved. So the anti-Semites also all say like that. The Jews are responsible for all the wars in the world, and the Gemara has such an idea. So that because the wars are a punishment for Ivus Adin and Bittul Torah, that's a Mishnah in Pirkei Avos, certain punishments correspond to certain Averis. So if we're not learning, if we're not Osik Melchama Shel Torah properly, HaKadosh Baruch Hu will cause Melchama. So that's why we assume that Liman Torah will give us Hatzlacha in the Melchama. So we need people learning in the yeshivas also. But you don't need thousands and thousands of people learning in the yeshivas. More correct is if they need thousands more people to wage the war in Eretz Yisrael. So they should, there are a lot of draft dodgers, chilonim draft dodgers, so not everybody is serving in the war. So the pashtus is that everyone has to participate in the milchama. The pashtus is that this din, that any Jewish man over the age of 20 is mechuyev to serve in the war, milchemes mitzvah, it applies even if you're not a citizen of Medinas Yisrael. Jewish people, Jewish men all over the world, over the age of 20, are mechuyev to serve in the war. The Israeli government never sends a ksav gius. They don't send, they don't draft us in the army. The United Nations, as it is not too favorable, doesn't look so favorably upon Medinas Yisrael. So if they're going to draft all the Jews all over the world, over the age of 20, so they'll shut down the whole Medinas Yisrael. They won't recognize it as a member of the UN anymore. So we need a little support. We're not going to get too much support. We need a little support from the whole world. So the pashtus is that even the Jewish men over the age of 20 in other countries, although even if they're not citizens of Medinas Yisrael, they're all mechuyev to help out. Whenever there is a milchama in Eretz Yisrael, so many people from many Jews all over the world volunteer to serve in the Israeli army, even though they're not drafted. That's stuck at the din. Pashtus is that is the din. The Minchas Chinuch points out whenever you're involved in a milchama, you know in advance that you may get killed. Everybody knows in a war, whoever goes in first is probably going to get killed. So why don't you say pikuach nefesh is derech kol haTorah kula? Sof pikuach nefesh, svek pikuach nefesh is derech kol haTorah kula. So the answer is, the Minchas Chinuch said that's obvious that whenever there's a chayvas milchama, there's no kula pikuach nefesh. It doesn't apply. And the pashtus is as well, like the quote in the name of Rabbi Yankov Kamenetsky, that let's say the enemy kidnaps Jewish soldiers. So is there a din of pidyon shvuim in the middle of a war? So strictly speaking, of course not. What mean pidyon shvuim? He's b'sakana. When you go into the army, you know you're going to be b'sakana. And you're mechuyev to fight in the army, even though your life is in danger. And the Israeli newspapers, they write about this. I think in this war in Gaza, that they just started off in Gaza, they wouldn't send you to Gaza unless you agreed to go. So the percentage of B'nai Torah who were killed, who were in the army in Gaza, was much higher than it is in general in the army. So in the Israeli newspapers, they wrote it up in a secular way, that they were raised by their religious parents and teachers to love the motherland so much that they're prepared to give their life. I don't think it's because of the love for the motherland. They say Kriya Shema every day, and we say B'chol nafshecha afilu noiteles nafshecha. Sometimes there's a din you're mechuyev to give up your life. Al kiddush Hashem. So milchama is one of the dinim where there's no din pikuach nefesh. These people who gave up their lives to serve in the war would have given up their lives for Avodah Zarah also, not just for milchama. It's not because of the love. It's a din. One of they're B'nai Torah. They observe what the dinim are. The dinim are mechuyev to serve in the army, even if there's a vaday sofek sakana. Even though there's a vaday sakana, forget about it. A svek of a sakana. So the pashtus is that there's no din of pidyon shvuyim for the Jewish soldiers who are captured in the war if it's going to be in conflict with the war effort. So we know that when they have an exchange of prisoners, and the Israelis have thousands of prisoners, and the Arabs have hardly any prisoners. So a lot of times the Israelis will release outright murderers. This fellow Sinwar was released at an earlier exchange of prisoners, and he was sick when he was in captivity, and they treated him in the hospital and everything, and it was to our detriment. So they really shouldn't have these swaps of prisoners, but that's the policy of the Israeli army. They think psychologically that because they promised the soldiers that if they will be captured by the enemy, they will do everything in their power to see to it that they free them. So the Israeli government is working with psychologists, and they're assuming that this is what gives the soldiers more strength to fight well. That's why they feel that helps them fight well. So if this is their policy, and they think that it helps them in the war effort, so that's why they will do pidyon shvuyim on the soldiers. But if it's a situation where you have no soldiers, just like the case where Rabbi Hutner was held in captivity, the Arabs hijacked a few airplanes of Jews who were going, private civilians. There are no soldiers then. They hijacked an airplane with a whole bunch of Jews on the planes coming back from Eretz to America. So then the pashtus is that there's no dinner pidyon shvuyim at that time. That's what Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky said at that time. The Gemara talks about the pasuk in Chumash Dvarim that says when we will be fighting the war to conquer Eretz Yisrael. The pasuk is talking about the Milchama in the days of Yeshua ben Nun, about Kibush Eretz Yisrael. So it says we will find bottom aleim kol tova shalom ileisa, homes full of food, refrigerators full of food, boros chatzuv mashaloch hatzofta, wine cellars full of wine that the enemy has, and we assume it's non-kosher food. The Gemara says kati lechazerit chazer. The Gemara says that for the Milchama of Kibush Eretz Yisrael, so you can even eat kadli lechazerit. The Rambam writes that it's only shiur vein lamayochal. If the soldiers are hungry and they have no food to eat, then they're permitted to eat non-kosher food. If they have kosher food available, then there's no heter to eat the non-kosher food. Then the Rambam says not only is it mutter to have treifa wine that's orlo or kloi hakerem, even if the treifa wine is yayin esach, that literally was a snasach l'avodah zarah, and that's an iser of avodah zarah, also mutter. That's the Rambam. And the Rambam says it's not restricted only to the Milchama of Kibush Eretz Yisrael. The Chumash writes it in the context of the Milchama of conquering Eretz Yisrael. But the Rambam says that it applies to any Milchama. Whenever the Jews are in Milchama, the soldiers in the army can eat the non-kosher food and so on. The Ramban in his commentary on Chumash, Ramban often disagrees with the Rambam, but he always disagrees with the greatest respect. The Rambam, when he disagrees with the halachas gedolos, every so often in the Sefer HaMitzvahs, the whole Sefer HaMitzvahs is patterned after the Sefer halachas gedolos that was written during the period of the Gaonim, after the days of the Amoraim and the Rabbanos Amoraim. So so when the Rambam, every so often the whole Sefer HaMitzvahs is patterned after the Bahag, but whenever the Rambam disagrees with certain details of the Bahag, he has a whole. He writes with bizyonis. So the Ramban always defends the Bahag. He doesn't always agree with the Bahag. A lot of times he agrees with the Rambam. But he was upset why the Rambam wrote with such nasty lashonos to disagree with the Bahag. You can defend the Bahag. So the Ramban on Chumash always writes with respect for the Rambam, but he disagrees on this topic, on the Kadli de Chazeris. He says, first of all, he thinks that the heter to eat a non-kosher food is only by Milchama's Kibush Eretz Yisrael, not by every Milchama. Then he says, number two, it's only heter on Macholos Asuris, not a heter on Yain Esach. Yain Esach is a Chash Avodah Zarah, has a shaychus with Avodah Zarah. You're not worshipping Avodah Zarah, but this wine was poured in front of Avodah Zarah, so it's Tikruvus Avodah Zarah. There's no heter on that, only on non-kosher food, an issue of kashrus. And then thirdly, the Ramban argues with the Rambam. The Rambam says the soldiers in the army are only allowed to eat the non-kosher food. If the soldiers are hungry, they have nothing else to eat, they have no kosher food to eat, then they're permitted to eat the non-kosher food. So here the Ramban claims that that's against the Gemara. The Gemara seems to in Chulin, towards the end of the first parak, around Daf Yud Zayin or so, the Gemara has a shaila. There's a machlokes there, Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Shmuel, during when the Jewish people lived in the Midbar for 40 years, that they have to observe all the laws of Shechita Hilchah Shchita Shiur Drasach Alad Hagrama V'Ikar. What's a Shchita Kshera? Or maybe the din was that Nechira min Atzaber is enough. Take, for example, the Gemara has a machlokes for the Shchita Loif min HaTorah. When you shecht chickens, when you shecht turkeys, so we require all the Chomish Hilchah Shchita Shiur Drasach Alad Hagrama V'Ikar. So there are Tanoim and there are Rishonim who paskin. The Rosh at the end of Yuma quotes the Maharam Rutberg who paskin that Shchita L'Oifis is only Midirabbanan. So Taisus and Chulant, Avchaf asked the Kasha, how can you say Shchita L'Oifis is only Midirabbanan? There's an institution of Nibla Soif Tahor. There's if it's a kosher bird and it didn't have a proper Shchita, so it has a din of Tumas. It's only Mitami when you swallow it. When you touch it, it's not Mitami. If you have a Niblas Behema V'chaya, an animal didn't have a proper shchita and it's dead, so it's matame b'maga b'masa. When you touch it, when you carry it, even if you carry it wearing gloves, so there's no maga, but there's going to be masa over there. Or if you push it, you move it, even though you're wearing gloves, there's no maga, but there's going to be masa. It's matame. Nivla soif tohar. Nivla soif tame is not matame at all. Let's say a dead eagle. An eagle is a non-kosher bird, so if you have a non-kosher bird and it's dead, it's not matame at all. But if it's a kosher bird and it didn't have a proper shchita, then it's a din on niblas of tamatama beis habliya. When you swallow it, then it's matama. It doesn't have tumas maga, doesn't have tumas masa, only has tuma when you swallow it. So Taisus asks, but if you hold ein shchita loif min HaTorah, so there shouldn't be any such a thing as niblas of tar. You don't need shchita. So even if it died naturally, it should be muta. The Taisus says no. Everybody agrees that you need nechira simanim and atzaber. That they all agree. So we say nechiras zui shchitasa by oifus. You don't need all the chamishul chashchita shiur drasach alad or gamavik. You don't need all the details. Nechiras simanim is enough. But if it be mesa me'eleha, the oif would die a natural death, then it would be an avela. Then everyone agrees that it's aser min HaTorah. It's not only aser midrabanan. Everyone agrees to that. So during the 40 years of Bnei Yisrael were in the midbar, Rabbi Akiva's opinion was nechira was enough. When they brought karbanos in the Mishkan, there they takadid in the shchita. For shchita's kachim, you don't say nechira simanim is enough in the midbar. But for the chulin, when they wanted to eat behemas chulin in the midbar, so they didn't need all the chomishul for shchita. It was enough nechira simanim and atav, just like the Tana who holds that ain't shchita loif min HaTorah, it's enough when nechira simanim. So in the midbar was enough nechira zoi shchitasa. And then when the Jews came into Eretz Yisrael, then it says, when you enter Eretz Yisrael, then you have to shech the chulin, just like I commanded, just like I instructed you in the midbar, all the 40 years by shchitas kachim, that you need all the chamishul shchita, you have to shech it properly. So when you come into Eretz Yisrael, even chulin needs zavachta kasher tzivisicha, you need all the halachas l'mashim. Kasher tzivisicha refers to the chamishul shchita, shiur drasach alad hagrama v'ikar. So the Gemara has a shaila. What if you had flesh from the days of Moshe Rabbeinu, and they did nechira simanim according to Rabbi Akiva, it's kosher. So they have to salt it, and they rinsed it off. They salted it. They put it in the days of Moshe Rabbeinu. Let's say they put it in a vacuum packed bag. And it says on the outside, Nishchat, Hudach, V'nimlach, V'hashgachas Moshe Rabbeinu Shlita, under the supervision of Moshe Rabbeinu. And then they cross over the Yarden. Once you cross over the Yarden, the laws change. You have to have Nechira Simonim. But this was Nishchat with Nechira Simonim in the midbar when Moshe Rabbeinu is still alive. That was the way you did the Shechita. The Gemara has a shayla, are they allowed to eat the Avery B'san Nechira Shechnisis Solo Aretz? Are they allowed to eat it? Or they say, no, we just pulled out the rug from underneath and you can't eat it anymore, even though this piece of meat was mutter yesterday, because in the midbar, Ever Bisan Chiru were mutter, and you salted it, took out the dam, but once you cross over the Yarden, that's considered. So that's a shayla in the Gemara. That's a discussion in the Gemara. So the Gemara asks, what is there to declare about? What is there to discuss? In the midbar, even Chazar is mutter. So of course Nevela is mutter. Even Nevela Mamish, you're asking, it was Nishchat during the lifetime of Moshe Rabbeinu, and then you put it in the freezer or you put it back in packed bag. doesn't get ruined, are you still allowed to eat it even after you cross over the yard? What's the shot? You can eat chazer. So the Gemara answers the kasha. No, you can eat chazer only if you take it from the enemy. Theirs, but you can't eat your own chazer. So here the shaila is, this had the Avery Bisan Nechira in the midbar, and it's left over till later, are you allowed to eat it or not? Because whatever you take from the goyim, that's mutter kadei chazer. But when we have our own chazer, that's not mutter. So the Ramban says if the Rambam is right that the heter to eat kadei chazer in the Shas Melchama is only kishira bein lemayochal. So what was the Gemara's kasha? Kadei chazer is mutter. We're talking of he's not hungry. We're talking, you have Avery Bisan Nechira that had Nechira in the midbar. Then you're allowed to eat a heter gomer, not only kashira ve'en l'mayachim. So that's the Ramban Tainas. The Gemara is against the Ram. So the Nurse Kelim explained the Havamina thought like that. Once you get to the Maskana, it's only mutter to take Mishalohem, our Kadei Chazer is also. So then the Lefia Maskana, the Rama holds a heter only applies kashira ve'en l'mayachim. Right. So that's a machlokes the Rambam and the Ramban. They say during the Melchemet HaShechrur in 1948, there wasn't enough kosher food for all of the soldiers. So many of the soldiers were not Shermei Mitzvah. So they had kosher food for the religious soldiers, and they had non-kosher food. They had nevela and treifa for the non-observant soldiers. They said that there was one colorful fellow in the army who was a character. I don't know if it's true. They tell a lot of stories about him. He was the brother of Nachman Leibowitz, Professor Leibowitz. So he said he wants to eat the non-kosher food. The Ramban says that it's mutter, even not kishira ve'en l'mayachal. Het the gomer, malchamel, kibush eretz Yisrael, het the gomer. That's how they tell. They tell a lot of stories about him. Could be a lot of them are not true, but he was a character. He was a personality. So that's one of the dinim. So they quote in the name of Rabbi Hershel Schachter, the Ramban points this out. The Rambam's opinion is that the heter kadei chazer to eat chazer during the Melchama is the heter of pikuach nefesh. Kishira ve'en l'mayochal. The Rambam writes kishira ve'en l'mayochal means if I'll miss, let's say one day, I have no food to eat for supper, so I'm not going to be b'sakana. Everybody has a lot of stored up energy, and they can skip a meal in there, here and there. That's not a problem. But in the army, you have to be relaxed, and you have to be awake, and you have to. If you're going to be hungry, you won't be able to fight well. I remember once every other year, there's always a Melchama in Eretz Yisrael. So one year there was a Melchama in the middle of the summer, and by mistake, the army sent 3 meals a day, breakfast, lunch, and supper to the soldiers. So by mistake, they sent fleishiks for the 9 days. So a lot of the soldiers are Ashkenazim, and they didn't want to eat the fleishik in 9 days. So the chief rabbi told them, they made a mistake that they sent fleishiks, but we insist you have to eat the fleishiks even on Tisha B'Av. You can't fast if you're fighting a war. If you're going to be a little bit hungry, you won't be able to be awake. You won't be all there to fight well. So that's what the Rambam holds, that for soldiers in the army, this is a heter kishira. If he's going to miss a meal, that's called already a suffix sakana. Because he may not, if he's going to be hungry, he won't be able to fight well. So that's why the Rambam thinks that it applies even to yayin nesach, not only a heter macholas hasuris. But the zor is yahareg val yaver. But to drink yayin nesach is not yahareg val yaver. When you're b'sakana, it would be mutter. So for a soldier in the army, this is considered a suffix sakana. That's why they insisted they should eat the flesh in 9 days. The army made a mistake sending fleishiks for supper, but they don't want the soldiers to skip a meal because they won't be able to fight well. No one is happy about any Melchama. No one is happy about killing the enemy. On Pesach night, when we say the Haggadah, so we drink l'chaim. We have our bekaisis. We're celebrating. So when they say the whole story, so we spill out a little bit of wine each time. The tzach hadash b'chav, he spilled out a little wine. Why? So the Meforshim are going to say we're going to drink halachaim at the end. We're not happy about the fact that they were esamakas. We're not happy about the fact that so many of the enemy lost their lives. So we spill out the wine. That we're not rejoicing over the fact that so many people died. So we have a din that in the opening chapter in Shaya, the Shabbos before Tisha B'Av is Shabbos Chazon. So we read Chazon Yeshayahu ben Amotz. So we say over there, Uve Farischem Kapechem, when the Kohanim lift up their hands to Duchen, Yidechem Alemeina Mikem. The Baruch Shalom said, I'm not going to listen to the Birchus Kohanim because Yidechem Damim Aleu. So the Gemara says, Kohen She'argas HaNefesh Lo Yisas Kappa. The Kohen who killed someone is not allowed to duchen. So Rosh Yeshiva was of the opinion that even if he killed someone b'makam mitzvah, David HaMelech killed a lot of Palestinian terrorists. They plished him. Abol Hagarcha Hashkim Laharga. So he was very successful in killing a lot of plishtim. And nonetheless, every time David HaMelech was successful in battle, he would set aside all the precious metal, the gold, the silver, and the copper, for the purpose of using in the Beis HaMikdash. And then after many battles, he had so much precious metal. So he asked the Navi, he can only build the Beis HaMikdash for authorization from the Navi. That's how it says in the Sifrei, and the Pasuk in Parshas Re'eh, the Shichna Sidushu, V'asal Shama Drosh Al Pi Navi. That Pasuk, that's in the context of the mitzvah of building a Beis HaMikdash. They had a Mishkan. Mishkan was L'hoi Roshah, but they wanted to build a Beis HaIlamim. The Beis HaMikdash is going to be Kitchel Lovai. So they were told, L'shichna Sidushu, Rosh Hashanah, Rosh Al Pi Navi. You have to have approval from the Nevi'im. And that's what the Gemara points out on the occasion of the Chet HaMeraglim, when the Meraglim came back from Eretz Yisrael, they gave a bad report that there's going to be Chazakumi Menu. The Sheva Umas who live in Eretz Yisrael are so powerful, they're stronger than him. They're stronger than the Rebbeinu Shalom. We don't stand a chance to win the war. The Gemara said that's how Pikur says. Chazakumi Menu. The Sheva Umas were stronger than the Rebbeinu Shalom. So, and all the Bnei Yisrael were crying. So the Gemara has a comment. You're crying for no good reason. There's nothing to cry about. I'm going to give you what to cry about. So the psukim in Yecheskel and in Tehillim say beferish that was told to Bnei Yisrael on the occasion of the Chet HaMeraglim. When they will enter Eretz Yisrael, they will be punished because of the Chet HaMeraglim. There will be the Beis HaMikdash will be destroyed, and they'll be sent into Golus. So when Shlomo Melech built the first Beis HaMikdash, he knew that it was going to be Chorif. He knew already from the days of the Meraglim. That's what it says. And the Chumash, it doesn't say it exactly. The Netziv interprets in the Pasuk. That's easy. He has a lot of times the original interpretation. So the Netziv interprets in the Pasuk, that Pasuk means that the Jews will be sent into Golos because of the Chet HaMeraglim. That's how the Netziv said. But leaving out the Netziv, it's a Pasuk. The Netziv quotes a Pasuk in Yecheskel and Pasuk in Tehillim. On the occasion of the Chet HaMeraglim, they were told already. So when Shlomo Melech built the first Beis HaMikdash, he knew that it's going to be Chorif. So the Ravid, in his Hasogas on the Rambam writes, he says it about Ezra, but he is assuming that the Beis HaMikdash, Shlomo Melech knew it's going to be Chorif, so he was only B'Kadeshit for the 400, the Bais Rishon lasted 410 years. He was only B'Kadeshit for 410 years, and during the 7 years of Golus Bavel, the Ravid doesn't agree with the Rama. The Rama holds from the days that Shlomo Melech built the first Beis HaMikdash, it was Kitchel Oselav. It had Kedusha, the Kedusha never left. The Ravid disagrees. He says, no, Shlomo Melech knew that it's only going to last a certain number of years. Didn't know how many years, 410 years, so he was only B'Kadeshit for that amount of time. And after the 410 years, then the Kedusha was Paka B'Chdi. So a surprising Ravid. And then Shlomo Melech said, B'Ruach HaKodesh, and Shiur, what's going to be after the 70-year punishment at Golus Bavel, and they build the second Beis HaMikdash? Will that be the everlasting Beis HaMikdash, or will that also be doomed to destruction? So he said, Im chaymahi nibna la tiras kesef im delasi So the Gemara gives an additional level of interpretation. This is not the Pshuto Shal Mikra, it's an additional level of interpretation. If at the end of the 70 years, all the Jews will return back to Eretz Yisrael, then the second Beis HaMikdash will be compared to a metal binyan, a metal structure, just like metal doesn't rot, so ein harekev sholed bo, so too the Baishenim will not rot away, and that has two mashmoyot, two meanings. Number one, the Baishenim will not be destroyed, and number two, HaKadosh Baruch Hu will continue to give us Nevi'im. When HaKadosh Baruch Hu loves us, so He sends Nevi'im to give us Musa and Techacha. We should do tshuva, and then He won't have to punish us. So the Rebbe Shalom said, if the liyalu kachayma, if at the end of the 70 years of Golas Bavel, all the Jews will return back to Eretz Yisrael, ein harekev sholad bo, rekev rat will not set in, not in the Beis HaMikdash, Baisheni will be lasting, it won't be destroyed, and rat will not set in, and Jewish people, Kadosh Baruch Hu will continue to send Nevi'im. What happened? V'mdelasi nafsu alelu achoris. However, if it'll be a shvacha aliyah, which it was, the Psukim say was 40,000 with change. There were hundreds of thousands of people in Golas Bavel. Many, many more. Hardly anybody, very small percentage came back in the beginning of Baisheni. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu said He's going to be angry. Not so alalu achoris. The Baisheni will be like a wooden hut, like a wooden bungalow, just like wooden buildings, rekev sholad bo, when it rains and it snows. So the wooden building rots away. So too, the Baisheni will be rekev sholad bo, number one. Baisheni will be chorev. And number two, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is not going to send any more Nevi'im. So that's what happened. So that's the Gemara is assuming, the Gemara says, Gemara has a brayso, Gimel Nevi'im alu imam et Bavel. In the beginning of the Baisheni, when Ezra and Nehemiah brought the Jewish people back, so there were 3 Nevi'im. What's the significance of that? Only 3 Nevi'im. And they were the last Nevi'im. And Chagas Chai Malachi. And Malachi signs off, Zichur Teres Moshe Abdi, you better observe the mitzvahs. I'm the last Navi, because HaKadosh Baruch Hu is angry. Rekeb Sholabo, He's not going to send any more Nevi'im. So you better observe Teres Moshe, because the Rebbe Shalom is angry, He's not going to send any more Nevi'im. Then the next pasuk says, the next Navi is going to be a long wait. Eliyahu Navi is going to come the day before Mashiach, and he will appear before the Sanhedrin. That's how the Gemara explains that pasuk in Maseches Eruvin. The day before Mashiach will appear. So he signs off, he says he's the last Navi. They all knew this. This was Baruch HaKodesh from Ezra, from Shlomo HaMelech, from what he wrote in Shir HaShirim. So that's what the Rabbid writes on the Rambam. Ezra knew from day number 1, when he completed the building of the Baisheni, he knew there was going to be Chorev. So therefore, he was only Mekadosh et Lizman, just like the Rabbid holds when Shlomo HaMelech built the first Beis HaMikdash, he already knew from the days of the Chet HaMeraglim. That's what it says in Yecheskel and in Tehillim. They already were told by the occasion of the Chet HaMeraglim that Bais Rishon is going to be Chorev. So when Shlomo HaMelech built the first Beis HaMikdash, the Rabbid understood it was only Mekadosh et Lizman. So to Yedei Hoya Ezra, when Ezra built the second Beis HaMikdash, that it's going to be Chorev, and therefore it was only Mekadosh et Lizman. So the Makam HaMikdash, according to the Rabbid, doesn't have any Kedusha. The Rambam does not hold like that. That's the Rabbid, Hilchos Beis HaBchira, disagreeing with the Rambam. Rambam holds that the Kedusha HaMikdash was Kitchud L'Oselova from day number 1. So this is part of the story of the Milchama in Eretz Yisrael. Rab Kook used to speak about the Reishis Michas Gula Seinu. He referred to the Balfour Declaration. Balfour Declaration, Lord Balfour was from Great Britain. They made the declaration during the First World War. They said they're going to give Palestine to the Jewish people. Then in the 1940s, they weren't giving it. They weren't keeping their promise. So the Palmach and the others that were pressuring the British to keep their promise. So Rav Kook used to refer to the Balfour Declaration as an Aschalta de Gula. So the Hungarian Rabbanim used to complain, where did he come up with a new Einfall? There's Aschalta. Either you have Gula, you don't have Gula. what is Geula? So that's what the Ramban, in his introduction to Chumash Shmos, explains that I have an old Chumash. My Chumash is a reprint of the European editions of the Chumash. When I got married 60 years ago, so my Chaverim bought me a whole bunch of Swarm. So the old Chumash has, by mistake, they printed the Ramban's Hakdama to Shmos at the end of Vaychi, the end of Bereshis. And now they put it at the beginning of Shmos. So he writes, Bereshis is the book of all the beginnings, about the beginning of the world, the beginning of mankind, the beginning of the Jewish people. By the time you finish Bereshis, you're introduced to Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, and the Shvatim. So that's what Bereshis is all about, all the beginnings, Bereshis. Shmos, he says, is the book regarding the first Golus and the Gula therefrom. First Golus was Golus Mitzrayim. And when you get to the end of Shmos, you have the Gula therefrom. So then the Ramban asks, how can I say that? But the Gula was only when they returned back to Eretz Yisrael. They don't return back to Eretz Yisrael till after Moshe Rabbeinu dies. So that's after the whole Chamishah Chumshe Torah. After Moshe Rabbeinu dies, he reads Sefer Yoshua. So in Sefer Yoshua it says, Yeshua ben Nun led the Jewish people over the Yarden, and they returned back to Eretz Yisrael. That's the Gula. How does you say that? And you get to the end of Shmos, you have the Gula. So the Ramban says, no, the main tragedy that the Jewish people went to Mitzrayim was not so much that they're not in Eretz Yisrael. That's a tragedy. The main tragedy was that they didn't have Hashvas Hashchina anymore. Kolzman that they were in Eretz Yisrael, they had the Bechina of, he uses as a Melitza, he paraphrases a Lashon HaPasuk in Eov, that Soda Laka Alei Ahaleim, they had a Hashvas Hashchina. And in Mitzrayim, when they went to Mitzrayim, they didn't have any Hashvas Hashchina at all. When you get to the end of Chumash Mos, they built a Mishkan. You have Truma Tetzava by Yaakov Kuri, 4 seders about the Mishkan. The Mishkan had Hashvas Hashchina. That's the Geula. That's what they say. The Chazon Ish moved, they left Europe way before the Second World War. He left, he had a dream. He has to move to Eretz Yisrael, so he moved. He lived in Vilna for a while. The end of his stay in Europe, he lived in Vilna. He was close, very close to Rabbi Chaim Oizer. And so he moved to Eretz Yisrael. So in 1948, when they established the Medina, so the quote the Chazon Ish said, this is the end of the Golus, but we don't yet have the Geula. So people thought that it was double talk. It was the end of the Golus. That's what I said, no. The Geula means you have a Beis Hamikdash, you have Ashras Hashchina. We still don't have a Beis Hamikdash. It says the end of the Golus, the British wouldn't allow any Jews to come to Eretz Yisrael. Now that Eretz Yisrael has a Jewish government, so they encourage and want everybody to come to Eretz Yisrael. So there's no longer any Golus. We choose to live in Chutz La'aretz, but we all belong in Eretz Yisrael. So he said, the Chazon Ish said, this is the end of the Golus. We're allowed to, the Ummah Shalom are letting us go to Eretz Yisrael, but we still don't have a Beis Hamikdash. So the Gemara makes a statement. The Hungarian rabbis used to attack Rav Kook in writing. What do you make up a new concept of Aschalta de Gulam? It's not his fault. The Gemara has the Lashon Aschalta. The Gemara says Melchames are Aschalta de Gulam. So the Chasam Sofer was of the opinion, and the Munkacher, the Minchas Oluza, and his Chuvas also has the same, that all Melchames in the world are Aschalta de Gulam. So the Chasam Sofer said about some Melchama in Europe that had nothing to do with the Jews. There was a war. Towards the end of his life, he lived in Pressburg in Hungary, and there was a war, and all the Jews had to leave the city. And he says he insisted they should say Avinu Malkeinu every day of the war. You need special tefillos when you have a war. And there was a suggestion: we should daven, we should be goyes at tainas, we should daven to Rebbeinu Shalom, the war should end. So the Chasam Sofer says you're not allowed to daven that the war should end because all the Melchames in the world are Aschalta de Geula, and you're slowing down. If you pray the war should end, you're slowing down the Geula process. You're not allowed to slow down the Geula process. So the Minchas Oluza, the Munkacher, he didn't live so long to see the Second World War. He died before, but during the First World War, he wrote the same. He quoted what the Chasam Sofer wrote in his diary. The diary is printed a long time before. So the Chasam Sofer wrote that all wars in the world are Aschalta. That's how he understood it. All wars in the world are Aschalta de Geula. You're not allowed to pray the war should end. So that's what the Minchas Oluza wrote about the First World War. It's Aschalta de Geula. The Pashtus and Rashi on the Gemara is that Aschalta, Melchames are Aschalta de Geula. The war is about Eretz Yisrael. Who will be the balabos over Eretz Yisrael? If the Jewish people win the war and we have control of Eretz Yisrael, that's Haschalta Degula, because the Gemara says that there are 3 mitzvahs that have to be fulfilled in a specific order. First, to establish a Jewish government over all of Eretz Yisrael. Secondly, to wipe out Amalek. Every government over a country has to have a standing army. So the army has to wipe out Amalek. And the third mitzvah is Binya Beis HaMikdash, Binya Beis HaBchira. So when you establish the Jewish government, 1948, that's an Aschalta Degula. When you have a Milchama and the Jewish people, not the Milchama, First World War, that has nothing to do with the Jews. When you have a Milchama, who's going to be the Balabas of Eretz Yisrael? And the Jewish people maintain ownership, maintain control of the government over Eretz Yisrael. That's called an Aschalta Degula. You see, the Fenech you don't have to have Ruach HaKodesh, you don't have to have a Novi to tell you that something is Aschalta Degula. He paskin dina based on the assumption that it looks like it's Aschalta Degula. These are some of the things to keep in mind in connection with this Milchama. We should all be healthy. We should all be zeicha to see the real Geula Shlema during our lifetime. Geula Shlema means the Binya Beis HaMikdash, b'meher b'yameinu.
Amen. Wow, incredible. Does the Rav have some time for questions?
Sure.
Maybe I would go first regarding freeing or Pidyon Shvuim. In 1976, when the terrorists hijacked plane to Entebbe, so Rabbi Chacham Ovadia writes that he assembled Rabbi Yoshev, of Shor Israeli, of Ben Sena Bashol, and apparently he writes that they all paskened that you should free terrorists to get them back, the hostages. So are they choilik on Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky?
Maybe they disagree whether it's called a Milchama then. It was like Rabbi Yan Kamenetsky said it when it was peaceful. But he said the fact that the Arabs all wanted to prevent Hakamas Hamdina, and then they weren't successful. They weren't successful. So he said the only country that signed a peace agreement with Eretz Yisrael was Egypt at that time. So Egypt is at peace and the others are still at war, but they weren't shooting guns, they weren't fighting. What they did was they were trying to kill the economy. So a big chunk of the Israeli economy is based on tourism. So if they hijack airplanes with the tourists, they're going back to America, and they give them a hard time. So they're trying to ruin the economy of Eretz Yisrael. So that's a shayla. Is that considered like in the middle of a war? So Rabbi Kamenetsky said, yeah, it's the hemshech of the Milchemet HaShechurur. So maybe the other Rabbanim held that it's not the hemshech. But if you're in the middle now, if you're in the middle of a war, this is mamash a war, middle of a war, that's a double pasha. There's no din of Pidyon Shvuim. That's the Minchas Chinuch says like that. Why isn't every soldier put from the army? Because it's suffix sakana. Worse than suffix sakana. The first soldiers he sent into the enemy are probably all going to get killed. The first group will go in. And nonetheless, that's the halacha. You have to ignore pikuach nefesh for some reason or another when you're waging a milchama. Probably the reason why is because pikuach nefesh of an individual is serious, but pikuach nefesh of Klal Yisrael outweighs pikuach nefesh of the Yechidim. So milchama, the Jews who live in Eretz Yisrael on the Jewish government, that's considered Klal Yisrael. That's the Rambam has that in a few places. The Abnei Nezer has 2 chalokim on Orach Chaim. So the first 2 tshuvas and the second chelik is in Hilchos Rosh Chodesh. So the first 2 tshuvas, he quotes the Rambam in the Sefer Mitzvahs and the Rambam in the Pirush HaMishnayos and other places that only the Jews who live in Eretz Yisrael are considered Klal Yisrael. All the Jews who live in Chutz La'aretz are considered Ki Yechidim Domu. Like the Gemara has a whole discussion. How come we only say Halal on Chanukah? We don't say Halal on Purim. So the Gemara gives 3 answers. The Gemara Megillah, Daf Yudal, the Gemara Erchin. So one of the answers is you only say Halal on a Nesha B'Eretz Yisrael. On a Nesha B'Chutz La'aretz you don't say. Why not? So the Minchas Chinuch suggests that's why. A Nesha B'Eretz Yisrael is a nest that saved Klal Yisrael. Even if there are millions of Jews who live in Chutz La'aretz, only 10 Jews, a minyan of Jews live in Eretz Yisrael. The minyan of Jews is called Klal Yisrael. So you only say Halal when it's a nest that occurred on behalf of Klal Yisrael. Nesha b'chutz la'aretz is for Yechidim. All of the millions of Jews who live in chutz la'aretz are considered Yechidim. The Minchas Chinuch has that suggestion. That's the pshat. He quotes the Maharsha, and the Chidush Agada has a different reason why. He says a Nesha Beretz Yisrael may be a Nes Nigla, like the Nes of the Pach Hashem, and that was a Nes Nigla. Nes Purim, Nesha b'chutz la'aretz is going to be a Nes Nistar. So the Maharsha said that's what it means. You only say Halal ala Nes if it's a Nes Nigla, like Nes Chanukah. But the Nes Purim is a Nes Nistar, so that you don't say. But the Minchas Chinuch doesn't agree. The Gemara didn't say that. The Gemara said Nesha Beretz Yisrael, Nesha b'chutz la'aretz. He thinks that because chutz la'aretz, the Gemara's lashon and tainus. The end of the first parak is that all the Jews who live in chutz la'aretz are kichidim dama. So it could be that they would also agree if you have a middle of a milchama that there's no din of pidyon shvuim. Pidyon shvuim is based on pikuach nefesh. There's no din of pikuach nefesh in a milchama. You're worried about pikuach nefesh of Klal Yisrael. It's a milchama about Eretz Yisrael. What about pikuach nefesh of Klal Yisrael? So you can't worry about the pikuach nefesh of the Yechidim if it's in conflict with the pikuach nefesh of the tzibur.
Any other questions?
Does that logic have something to do with Milchama specifically, or anytime releasing terrorists? Anytime releasing terrorists who have a record of trying to kill people?
That is a problem. Okay. That should always be a problem. Yeah. You have to judge in each case, which is Adiv. Pikuach nefesh of the Yochad, Pikuach nefesh of the Tzibur, which is Karvel Avadai, which is Sofik, which is Sexveka. You have to judge what makes sense. But you can't just go with the regular dinim of Pidyon Shvuim, the regular dinim of Pikuach nefesh, because you have Pikuach nefesh of the Klal Yisrael is in conflict with the Pikuach nefesh of the Yechidim. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much for the Rav's time. We always appreciate the Rav's Divrei Torah, and looking forward for the next time on hopefully. I don't know if we should daven for the war to end or not, but
We should be zeicher that before Pesach we should be able to bring a korban pesach. Okay.
Amen.
Ken Yehi Ratzon.
Amen. Shkoyach. Amen. And grace and shkoyach.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay.
You mentioned that